The old jukebox crackled to life with a country tune, blending with the smell of grilled beef patties filling the diner. A coin was tossed and rolled across the tile floor, spinning like mocking laughter. Sarah set down the coffee cup, her scarred hands trembling ever so slightly, but she did not bend to pick up the coin. Her gaze, steady and unwavering, made the table of customers falter. In the corner, an aging veteran clenched a worn photo of soldiers, watching her every move. He knew there was more than met the eye. If you believe scars carry the memory of sacrifice, follow humankind stories so you don't miss what happens next. Mel's diner buzzed with its usual morning crowd. The long chrome counter gleamed, rows of red leather stools lined up neatly, the smell of burgers and pancakes mixing with the jukebox's worn-out country tune. At a back booth, a group of young men in football jerseys, still damp with sweat from practice, argued animatedly over last night's baseball game. It was the kind of familiar scene any American would recognize. In that noisy backdrop, Sarah Miller was almost invisible. Despite the humid summer heat, a long-sleeved shirt buttoned to the wrist always conceals. Her scarred hands had made many customers avert their eyes. She had worked in silence for 3 years, enduring sneers and the cruel game of coins tossed onto the floor as tips. When a young man flipped a coin onto the ground this morning, Sarah did not bend to pick it up. She stood tall, setting a coffee cup firmly on the table with her rough but steady hand, then lifted her eyes to meet his. That stare was not hostile, nor was it pleading. It was steady, unyielding, enough to make his smirk falter and die. The coin kept spinning on the tile, its ringing sound slicing through the air. Behind the counter, the diner owner frowned, casting Sarah a look that silently urged, "Just endure it." A younger co-worker walked past, shaking her head with a dismissive smirk. The whole room had grown used to treating Sarah as an outsider, someone present but never acknowledged. In a corner booth, Michael Kelly had been sitting since dawn. 3 cups of coffee had gone cold before him, but he hadn't moved. His calloused hand gripped an old photograph in his jacket pocket. For 18 years, he had searched for a face, and now every movement Sarah made hammered at his memory. He watched the way she navigated between tables. Not hurried, not clumsy. Every action is precise, almost disciplined. She kept her left shoulder slightly turned, as if unconsciously shielding herself. The way her eyes flicked quickly around the room, scanning from the front door to the register, then back to the customers. These are tiny details, but they are impossible to miss for a veteran trained to survive in chaos. But it all came down to the scarred waitress for the other patrons, and that was enough for them to mock and toss money on the floor to see if she would stoop to pick it up. Sarah drew a deep breath and bent down to pick up the last coin. The metallic clink against her rough palm echoed harshly. She rose, continuing her work as if nothing had happened. But in her eyes, still holding that unwavering light, something made Michael Kelly's chest tighten. He knew the silent shell was not all she was. There was another past, hidden beneath fabric and scars, waiting to be dragged back into the light. And when it surfaced, every laugh in this diner would shatter. The diner bell jingled, cutting over the jukebox. 3 men walked in, the smell of construction dust clinging to their shirts. Leading them was Chad Morrison, once a high school football star, now just a construction worker still clinging to his swagger. His company t-shirt stretched over a gym-built body, his eyes sweeping the room like a predator. The atmosphere shifted instantly. A few younger patrons fell quiet, and an older man in the corner raised his newspaper like a shield. Chad smirked and strolled to a table in the center, dropping heavily into a seat, his two co-workers following like trained hounds. Sarah approached, tray in hand. Her smile was strained, but her steps were steady. Chad leaned back in his chair and swatted the menu aside. "Too hot," he muttered, then deliberately tipped a cup of cold coffee across the table, letting the dark liquid spill over the edge and drip to the floor. He pointed at the mess, a spreading stain at his feet. Sarah stood still. The tray pressed into her scarred hand. Chad raised an eyebrow, his voice mocking. He wanted her to clean it, like a servant. His buddies burst into loud laughter, making sure everyone heard. At a corner booth, a young mother winced, half rising as if to speak, then sank back when Chad shot her a sharp glare. The silence spread, but not absolutely. A few heads shook, a few whispers of disapproval rippled. Many were uncomfortable in a small-scale society and diner, but none dared stand up. Sarah set the tray on the counter, took a rag, and wiped the table efficiently. Yet her eyes never left Chad's, gaze unflinching. A flicker tugged at the corner of his mouth. He had felt the challenge. He pushed further. As Sarah turned to leave, Chad stuck out a foot, sending her drink tray wobbling. But instead of spilling, her hands twisted with practiced ease, balancing it perfectly. A glass slid toward the edge, about to fall, when she tilted her wrist and caught it in time. The move was so swift that a few young men gasped, "Wow," under their breath. Chad's face tightened. He wasn't used to being upstaged. He dropped his voice to a cutting sneer, taunting Sarah's appearance, comparing her scars to grotesque accidents. The laughter of his friends no longer rang with confidence. It sounded forced. One even glanced nervously around, as if aware of eyes on them. From his booth, Michael Kelly gripped his coffee cup. Every insult was a knife dragging him back to Ramadi. Every restrained motion of Sarah's matched the memory of a soldier who once ran into fire. Yet Sarah stayed silent. Only her hand, clutching the tray, tightened until the veins stood out against pale skin. The whole diner seemed to hold its breath. Either she would break, or Chad would push one step further. And everyone knew that moment was coming. The coffee stain had barely dried when Chad shoved another tray toward Sarah, deliberately knocking a wobbly chair off balance. The chair tipped sharply, about to crash into the young mother holding her child nearby. In an instant, Sarah spun around, left hand steadying the tray, right hand shooting out to catch the falling chair. The move was so quick that several customers gaped in disbelief. The glass of water on her tray stayed perfectly upright. Not a single drop spilled. The diner froze for a beat, as though everyone had just witnessed something impossible to explain. Chad smirked, but the grin no longer seemed inevitable. He threw out another round of jeers, yet some customers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting. A young man muttered, "She's got balance like a Marine." The words drifted into the air, startling a few others. Sarah bent to pick up a knife that had slipped from the tray. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly as her fingers touched the metal, murmuring a short command, one only someone drilled in military training would know. An older veteran at a far corner booth furrowed his brow, whispering to his wife, "That stance. You can't mistake it." Michael Kelly held his breath. Before him was not just a humiliated waitress, but a familiar figure. He remembered Ramadi, the flash of an IED, the Humvee hurled sideways, the screech of tearing metal, the stench of smoke and blood, and a hand pulling him out, swift, steady, fearless. His heart pounded, sweat dampening his forehead. He gripped the photo in his pocket, fingers trembling as they traced the faded faces of old comrades. No, It can't be, he told himself. But Sarah's every motion screamed the opposite. Chad still refused to relent. He hurled fresh insults, this time aimed at the scars on Sarah's wrist. A few chuckles rang out, but the laughter no longer carried. A middle-aged man shook his head, muttering, "That's too much." Sarah stood motionless, her tray still perfectly balanced in her hands. Her eyes cast downward, but her grip on the tray's edge whitened her knuckles. The restraint inside her coiled like a spring. Michael could feel it. This was no longer some cruel diner prank. This was when the fire of the past threatened to break through. He glanced at the faint outline of ink peeking beneath Sarah's sleeve as she bent her arm. The shape was too familiar. Another shard of battlefield memory pierced his mind. No one else in the diner realized it, but a secret was being forced into the light. And when it broke open, every laugh and every sneer would lose meaning. The explosion came when Chad pushed too far. He lunged, shoving Sarah hard in the shoulder. The tray flew from her hands, cups and plates crashing, coffee splattering across the tiles. Sarah staggered, her sleeve sliding back above her elbow. Everyone saw it under the harsh neon light. An old tattoo. The ink faded and blotched, but still unmistakable. The emblem of the 3rd Infantry Division, etched beside a single name, Johnson. Surrounding it were jagged burn scars, the permanent signature of fire and steel. The diner went rigid. The jukebox kept humming, but its tune was swallowed by the heavy silence. Michael Kelly shot to his feet, his chair toppling behind him. His eyes locked on the tattoo, his hand trembling as he pulled a crumpled photo from his pocket. The photograph, taken 18 years earlier, a squad of young soldiers in Ramadi, their faces alight with youth. And the only woman among them, gaze fierce, standing beside a tall sergeant. On her sleeve, then, the very same emblem. Michael's heart hammered, as though the IED blast had struck again. He saw the Humvee engulfed in flames, heard bullets snapping in the scorching heat. He saw that hand dragging him through a narrow window, heard the hoarse command, "Hold on to me!" And when the second blast came, it was her body that shielded him. Michael stepped forward slowly, eyes reddened, voice trembling. Ramadi, summer 2006. Sarah stiffened, her whole body tensing. Her hand instinctively covered the tattoo, and her face was pale. An old veteran stood from another booth, voice hoarse. "That battle, I remember." A young woman gripped her friend's hand, whispering, "She's a real hero." Chad barked out a laugh, but the sound rang hollow. He jabbed a finger toward the tattoo, shouting, "Fake! She's making this up for attention!" But this time, another patron snapped, "Shut up! You don't understand!" Michael stepped closer, raising the photo beside Sarah's scarred face. Scars could change a body, but the eyes never lie. His voice cracked as he said, "Well, you pulled me out of the fire. You saved my life." Somewhere in the diner, a fork clattered to the floor, dropped by someone too stunned to hold on. The truth had shattered every prejudice in the room. The woman was mocked and dismissed for 3 long years, but now stood revealed as a living emblem of sacrifice. Sarah stood there, breath ragged, with nowhere left to hide. Every gaze on her now carried something new, not derision, but awe, respect. Chad staggered back a step, his face draining of color. He no longer controlled the room. His cheap power dissolved like foam in the tide. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes locked on the old photograph in Michael's hand. A memory surged back, sharp as a blade. The face of Sergeant Johnson, his breath fading in her arms just before the fire consumed the vehicle. His dying words still echoed, If I don't make it, live enough for both of us. She swallowed hard, her lips trembling. I promised Johnson that I would live his share too. Her voice was hoarse, but it carried clearly through the tense silence. The diner went utterly quiet until an unexpected movement broke through. The older man at table 3 pushed himself up with his cane. His face was flushed, eyes misting. He extended a trembling hand, clasping Sarah's scarred one. "Thank you," he whispered. His wife stood behind him, nodding, tears in her eyes. A young mother carrying her child rose as well, stepping closer. She bowed, voice breaking. "I'm sorry for staying silent." Sarah met her gaze, her eyes softening as she slightly nodded. The atmosphere in the diner shifted dramatically. Those who had always looked away now lifted their heads, one after another, eyes filling with respect. A group of young men sheepishly set their phones down, no longer eager to film mockery, but sitting up straight, attentive. Michael placed the photograph gently on the table. His voice cracked, yet carried pride. "Because of you, I lived to see my daughter again. She's grown now, with a family of her own. Every moment of that was thanks to you." His hand pressed against his chest, over old scars, his eyes on Sarah, shimmering with gratitude. Sarah bit her lip, tears rising beyond her control. For 3 years working as a waitress, she had treated her scars as burdens to hide. But now, they stood as proof of a promise kept, of lives carried on her shoulders. Chad stood stiff, forcing a hollow laugh. "Just a sob story. Don't believe." But instantly, one of his 2 friends snapped at him. "Enough, Chad. You went too far." The words struck like a hammer, shattering the last fragile support he clung to. In that moment, isolation closed in on Chad. The laughter that once followed him was gone. Even his own companion's contemptuous stares reflected the truth. He had dragged himself into disgrace. Sarah lifted her head, brushing away tears. For the first time in years, she did not hide her scars. Under the cold neon lights, they stood as witnesses to a promise, a sacrifice, and a survival. The diner settled into silence again, but no longer the silence of fear or complicity. It was a silence of reverence, heavy yet dignified, as if everyone understood they had just witnessed something beyond the ordinary. The air in Mel's diner seemed frozen after her confession. Then, a sound cut through, a clap from the older man with the cane. Next, the young mother joined, her eyes wet. One by one, others followed, the applause spreading steadily, not all at once. A few patrons remained silent, shaking their heads uneasily. But that only made the moment more real. Justice is never perfect, but it begins with the hands brave enough to act. Michael turned to Sarah, slowly pulling something small from his pocket, a tarnished silver pin, worn by years. He placed it in her hand, voice breaking. "You deserve to be remembered, not just by me, but by everyone." Sarah looked down at the pin, her scarred fingers tightening around it, her breath trembling. Years of shame dissolved in her eyes, replaced by something new, peace. The diner owner stepped out from behind the counter, her voice firm. "From now on, you're not just a waitress here. You're someone we're proud of." She laid a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "I'll cover the next shift. You, prepare for the veterans gathering this weekend. They need to hear your story." Chad stood mute, his face drained of color. He edged backward toward the door, but no one made room for him. A woman's voice rang out from the back. "Leave, and don't come back." The diner owner declared, You insulted my employee and you slandered a soldier. Get out, for good. Chad's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. Dozens of messages, social media notifications flashing his name. His face twisted in despair. He shoved the door open and stumbled out, leaving behind a room full of scornful eyes. Inside, the applause faded into quiet. Sarah still stood there, shirt disheveled, scars exposed under the lights. But this time, no one turned away. The eyes fixed on her no longer carried pity. They carried respect. Michael pressed his hand to his chest, over the wounds that still lingered in memory. He gave a slow nod, his gaze carrying the thank you he had been unable to say for 18 years. Sarah lifted her head, her voice low but steady. "We scars don't tell of what was lost. They tell of the lives that remain." The room fell into a short, heavy silence. Then several people bowed their heads. A young woman whispered, "That line should be on the wall." Sarah returned to the counter, slipping the silver pin into her pocket. Her steps no longer carried the hush of a shadow. Each footfall echoed like the heartbeat of the diner itself, leaving behind a lingering reverberation.